So some wines you might taste and you feel it all back here. Probably this Pinot, you taste it a little more in the back. And then you get that little bit of a dryness, like sandpapery feel on your tongue and the roof of your mouth. Yeah, that's called tannic acid. And tannins are in wine, and it usually comes from like the seeds and from the stems that are left in sometimes. That's where a lot of the tannins come in. That's why what's that?
This red wine.
This one, right. And you feel it kind of like this on the top of your mouth.
Yes.
It's rough and dry. Right, those are the tannins. Now, tannins actually are good for some wines. Cabernets, when you look at great Bordeaux wines, you drink them, they're 100 years old. If you drank them the first year, you would spit it out because it would be so rough like that in your mouth. There's so much tannin, but what happens is the tannin will help age the wine. So as the wine gets older, and you can't do it with a lot of different wines, some Pinots, a lot of Cabernets for sure, what happens is you can put it away. And those tannins go away after a while, and more fruit and more, the wine's alive still in the bottle. The wine's a living thing in that bottle, and it changes every day. If I drink it when it's hot or it's cold, or I leave it for a year, or I run it through one of these, this is the latest thing now up in Napa. It's called a venturi. And what this does is it aerates the wine. When you pour wine through it, it goes like this. You can hear the bubbles, and it bubbles the wine. But what that does is that's like aging the wine. So you can pour it right through the venturi. I take it out, and we can pass it around if you'd like. You pass wine through this, and what happens is a wine that you probably wouldn't want to, well, it's okay to drink now. See? I can pass this around if you want. Then there's a little hole on the side that adds the air, right? But what it does is it aerates that wine, it oxidizes it, and it helps break down some of the tannins, and it brings out more of the flavors of the wine. So now wineries, when you go for tastings, I don't want to say cheat, but somebody figured out that you can pour it through one of these into your glass, and then that wine's going to taste much better than if you didn't use one of these. Because most wineries don't want to sit on wine for 2 or 3 or 4 more years. They want to sell it now, right? They need to make money off of it now. And so that's one of the ways that they deal with tannins in some of the red wines. Yes?
What age were you when you learned all about this from your parents?
At the dinner table, having a little glass of wine at the dinner table was something that we did very young. But that was not, we weren't drinkers. The family wasn't drinkers. It was more, we learned to respect it. And I was probably about 10 or 11 when I got, not filling up come on, fill up the bottle here. But, to get a little glass of wine, that was a big thing in the Sicilian family. That was big. When Dad reached over and said, here, Mike, you have a little bit of, wine, I was growing up. I was becoming that, I was becoming the man. So yeah, that was probably about 10 or 11. And again, in those days, does anybody remember the wine Tipo? Tipo red and Tipo white? Very, very big. They used to give away salt and pepper shakers, like the little old, remember the old Chianti bottles, right? That was very big when I was young, and that was one of the wines back in the 50s and 60s that we served at the restaurant. And it was in the old wicker basket-looking bottles, like the old Chianti bottles, and it was Tipo, and their thing was, if you bought a bottle of Tipo wine, you got a salt and pepper shaker. And I just remember we had like a whole shelf of these salt and pepper shakers because we would drink. It was an inexpensive, good wine back in those days. But then I think I really started enjoying wine when I got into college. When I went back east, I went to a culinary program. I don't know if you're familiar with the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, but those of us that graduated from there would like to think that it is the best program in the world. And at the time, we would compete against the Cordon Bleus and Johnston in Wales and some of the other world-renowned, and we would do very, very well. We were one of the top programs. But we got a chance to taste wines and to go through a wine program at that time. And I got very much interested in that. And then when I came back and I started working for my father, within a year or two, that's when the big California wine explosion started. So I was able to, from that point, like right from the very beginning, taste the wines and enjoy the wines and go to some grand tastings. And for me, it was fun. I was always a kid that would like to take things apart to find out how they worked. And I somehow relate that to drinking wine. I can relate to, like, when I taste it, I take apart the little, bits and pieces. And if somebody tells me where it was grown, and there are so many more people that are much more expert about these things than me. But I have fun enjoying, thinking, oh, okay, I know that region, and I know what the smells and the sights and what the dirt looks like there, and now I know why this wine tastes the way it does. Any other questions so far before we move on to the last wine? No? Okay. So we had the Pinot so far. I didn't talk about where it was from. Giulio Vineyards. Is everybody familiar with BV? Giulio Vineyards. They do so many different wines. They've been around probably almost as long as anybody else up in the area. So the Pinot, they make so many different ones. The one difficulty is if you go and say, I want to buy a bottle of BV Cab or a BV Pinot, right? Which one? Because you could probably buy one for about $6 or $8, and you could probably buy one for hundreds of dollars. But this one here is their coastal estate. Giulio, or BV as we call it, is so big that they've got vineyards all over the place. So some of them grow better grapes than others, right? Some of them, the coastal area will taste different than certain valleys or certain other areas. And so BV, though, has some wines. You can buy wines from BV that are thousands and thousands of dollars. But it's called Giulio, and this is California grown. When you look at the labels, some of the labels now will have what's called appellations. And an appellation would be, Alexander Valley is an appellation now. Because remember we said, depends on where the grapes are from, how it could grow different and taste different. How much sunshine does it get, and what temperature? You can go 2 miles down the road and the average temperature could be different in that vineyard than somewhere else. So if the temperature is different, the amount of sun they get, the type of soil, all those things will change the wine. So like in France, we decided to have appellations. And so some of these will have the name of the appellation, like Alexander Valley. Now this one, Coastal Estates, just says California grown. And one of the reasons for that is they pull from several different areas. And going back to, and we can pour the last wine, going back to Ernest and Giulio Gallo. Everybody's familiar with Ernest and Giulio Gallo, right? They, during the downtime when wine had a little bit of glut, I guess it was back in the 70s, 80s, when everybody got into the wine industry and suddenly there were almost too many grapes, and there were a lot of small wineries and vineyards that sprouted up and then lasted only a few years, and then they went out of business. Ernest and Giulio Gallo went around under different names. Oh no, that's okay, I'll get it for you. There you go. What Ernest and Giulio Gallo did, a little sneaky. Nobody wanted to sell them their vineyards, so they opened up different companies. And they went and bought up all the little wineries that were going out of business because they wanted the grapes. The more grapes, the more wine they can make. So they had different names for the companies, and they went and they just bought anybody who was going out of business, they were buying it under all these different companies, and eventually it turned out to be Ernest and Giulio Gallo. Well, Ernest and Giulio Gallo, a lot of people started saying, as I mentioned earlier, that's cheap wine, that's jug wine, that's no good. And Europe was saying, wow, this is some of the best jug wine that's made. Ernest and Giulio Gallo got upset about that, and back in 1978, they put out their special vintage. They said, at the time, I think they owned, I want to say 60% of all the grapes in that area. And they were buying them all from all different areas and then making wine from it. So what they said was, instead of throwing them all together, 60% of the grapes, we're going to pull the best grapes from these small areas and make them individual wines. And so they did that. And I was just as just as guilty of this. But it had the name Ernest and Giulio Gallo, and people just didn't think of that as being a special wine. I went to a grand tasting at the Fairmont. And oh, boy, talk about a tough night. We tasted 100 red wines and 100 white wines. Now, we had something to spit the wine into, so we didn't swallow. But that doesn't mean that after, 150 of them, I'm not saying, sure, bring on the next one. That's hard to drink that many, even taste that many wines. But my favorite red wine out of all of them was the Ernest, and there was blind, so we didn't know which ones, was Ernest and Giulio Gallo's private label. And it sold for $7 a bottle. And out of 100 red wines, the prices didn't matter. They were all different prices. The $7 bottle was, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, the best. Yes?
Yeah, it was like a little bit sweet.
The Ernest and Giulio, just a little bit. And that's, you mean on this, the one we're drinking now, or the Ernest and Giulio Gallo? The Gallo, yeah. And guess what? You're absolutely right. And you know why? They cheated. Well, not really. Not really, we tease. What they did was they stopped fermentation, and a lot of wineries do this. They stopped the fermenting just before all the sugar was gone. So what happens is you drink it, and then suddenly it's like, oh, you have a really nice feel in your mouth. We said it's rich and ripe and full in your mouth. Some of that's because of the sugar. Remember, we all like sweet more than we like sour usually, or salty. Most people, it's like if you gave spinach or chocolate pudding to a baby, we all know which one the baby would go for, right? They go for the sweet one. So it's the same with us. And so that's how they tricked everybody at that tasting, was they left a little residual sugar in. And like you said, so little that you don't really taste it until you're on about your second glass. So if you were just tasting it, first sip or two, you don't taste it because there's not a lot there. But I went out to dinner the next night with my family. And I went into a very nice French restaurant, and they had a beautiful wine list, and it was on the menu for $15 or $12, I think it was. And I looked at it, and I stared at it, and I got to tell you, and I was young and kind of dumb at that time. I'd never do that again. I wouldn't spend the extra money. I wouldn't buy the wine because I was embarrassed. I couldn't buy Gallo at a restaurant. And so I bought another wine that was a little more expensive that I knew was also very good. But when the waiter brought it, I told him I was guilty. I said, I feel really bad. I tasted the Ernest and Giulio Gallo wine at the tastings, and it was my favorite. But I just couldn't get myself to order Gallo in a really nice restaurant. And he laughed and he said, sir, we've had it on the menu for 2 weeks, and we have not sold a bottle yet. So I wasn't alone. But I say that because as I started off this presentation, it's not about how expensive a bottle is. It's not about anything more than what do you like best.